Okay, good morning, everyone, and Shavua Tov. This morning we present with you another edition of the Fifth Avenue Synagogue Sunday Speaker Series. And today we have the opportunity to hear from Michael Freund, founder and chairman of Shavei Israel, Shavei Yisrael. And Shavei Yisrael assists lost Jewish tribes and individuals in similar predicaments. And I've personally seen firsthand the incredible work that Shavei Yisrael does. I visited Poland numerous times on Jewish tour groups, and we've had sessions with the Polish branch of Shavei Yisrael, and I've seen firsthand how they have helped bring many Polish Jews back into the fold. Michael also worked in Israeli politics and is a columnist for the Jerusalem Post. And Michael's family is no stranger to the Fifth Avenue Synagogue. His parents, sister, and brother-in-law are all members of the shul, and it's a great honor. It's wonderful to have them part of our community. And last but not least about Michael, I do believe he is a very big New York Giants fan. Is that correct, Michael?
Yes, and Mets, and the Mets.
So I hope you approve their recent maneuvers on draft night. I think you once wrote, what was your article? Is God a sports fan? What was the name of the article you once wrote?
Does God care what happens in the Super Bowl?
But by the way, that was Robin Roth.
The answer was only if the Giants are in the Super Bowl. Correct. That's the. Now, formally introducing Michael will be Michael's sister, Rebecca Sugar, and Rebecca is a highly talented and capable individual who has a deep commitment to the Jewish world and the state of Israel. I've also seen firsthand how she labors arduously to help educate Jews around the world and to do whatever she can to support and protect the great state of Israel. For many years, she was the director of Birthright Israel Alumni, which was the alumni organization of Birthright Israel. And through her leadership, the organization engaged and educated thousands of young Jewish professionals here in New York City upon their return from Birthright trips. And I personally owe a great debt of gratitude to Rebecca. I worked in her organization for her for many years, downtown in the Village. Memorable years for me, very fond memories. I learned a tremendous amount from her professionalism all those years. And besides being a truly enriching experience for me, it also served as my professional segue into the communal Jewish world here in New York. And Rebecca played an instrumental role in helping me come to Fifth Avenue Synagogue. So my family and I are truly indebted to her on a variety of levels. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Eddie and Rebecca are dear members of the Fifth Avenue Synagogue. They support the shul, they're engaged in the shul, and we look forward to working with them on future programming in the new building and celebrating many family happy occasions together for years to come.
Amen.
Now, Michael, Rebecca will introduce you now, and she did promise us that she's only going to try to say nice things, but in all honesty, I cannot guarantee that that's actually going to happen. So if you can please pay your attention to Rebecca.
Thanks, Eli, Rabbi, for organizing this morning and for saying such nice things about me, which I'm not sure I earned, but we can talk about that later. I'm thrilled to introduce Michael, my brother. Yes, the temptation is strong to roast a sibling when given such an opportunity. But as you mentioned, I did discover that Michael became a rabbi just a few short years ago, and so I'm a little more reluctant to do what I would normally do, given his esteemed label now. So I'm going to just brag about him a little bit, if that's okay. Michael graduated from Princeton University and Columbia Business School. He moved to Israel in 1995, and he quickly was appointed to become Benjamin Netanyahu's deputy communications director. He was just 28 years old at the time. In 2002, he founded Shavei Yisrael, and he's received numerous awards and prizes for his work, including the Jerusalem Prize and the Moskowitz Prize. He's published 2 books, and he's a syndicated columnist for the Jerusalem Post. The work that Michael does with Shavei is, in my view, historically, intellectually, politically, nationally and Jewishly fascinating. I'm excited for all of you to hear about it. You know, the American Jewish world used to emphasize the importance of Aliyah, I think, much more when I was young. The Russian Aliyah, the Ethiopian Aliyah, these were unifying missions of our time. Today, I think we need to focus again more on Aliyah and the populations that Michael brings and that he works with. They bring to Israel not only Zionist passion and a commitment to Judaism, but they bring with them language skills and education and relationships that really benefit the state politically and economically as well. I think it's really something worth paying attention to. His vision, Michael's vision for Aliyah, the Aliyah of lost Jews, in quotes, around the world, really has implications for the entire Jewish people. And I'm really proud of him for his tireless work and his commitment to this work. There's really no better leader for this work than my brother. So with that, over to you, Jacob and Michael.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Eli Babich. So Michael, because your parents are longtime members of the Shul and Rebecca's a member, can you give us some background on Fifth Avenue Synagogue and the Freund family to start, please?
Well, as you mentioned, they're all longtime active members of the synagogue. And whenever I have the opportunity to come into New York, at least before Corona struck, I too had the pleasure of attending the shul. And I know that it has a very special place and role in their lives.
Okay, were you like bar mitzvah to the shul? Like how your history goes back how far on a personal level?
Not that far. I'm 52, and I made Aliyah about 26 years ago. So there you have it.
Okay, so tell us, because we're gonna, you made Aliyah 26 years ago. So what inspired you to do that? Rebecca said you went to Princeton, you went to Columbia. Give us the story of your making Aliyah, please.
Sure. I grew up in a very Zionist family. My late grandmother, Dr. Miriam Freund Rosenthal, was the national president of Hadassah in the 1950s. And she was one of those old time Zionists that I don't know if they still make them anymore, but in America. But the whole atmosphere in the house was suffused with Zionism and Jewishness and concern for the Jewish people and the Jewish future. So that left a big imprint on me. And there are two things I remember from the year 1977. One is when the New York Mets traded Tom Seaver, who was their main pitcher. And more importantly, that was the first time that I visited Israel as a 9-year-old boy. And I knew even then that I felt at home here in a way that I don't feel at home anywhere else. So even then I knew that one day, or I hoped that one day, I would be able to make the move.
So, okay, so 9 years old, you go to Israel, your first trip, you feel something in your heart that connects you to Israel, and then take us through the actual process. You made Aliyah at 26 years old, is that correct?
Well, at the age of 16, I became a Baal Tshuva. I became religiously observant. And one of the things I noticed, and maybe I'm touching a raw nerve here, but one of the things I noticed is that obviously in the Shemona Esrei every day, we ask God 3 times a day to gather us all back into the land. And for 1900 years, for the most part, that's all our ancestors could do, is they could plead with God to bring us back. And we're fortunate to live in a generation where we have the ability to do so. And that was a further spur for me that I felt that I wanted to be on the field. I wanted to be active and play a role in the unfolding of the Jewish future here. And so after I completed my MBA at Columbia, I made Aliyah in February 1995.
Okay, great. You before we move on, so at 16 years old, you became religious, you said?
Yeah.
And was that through school or synagogue, or I'm just curious what inspired that? Was that part of
Um,
Israel also?
it was a series of events. I mean, I went to Ramaz, and so I don't know if it's because of that or despite that, but I did become observant. And there was a teacher there who was very influential. There was an experience I had in Israel on a summer tour that also left a very deep imprint. Uh, Maybe I'll just share it quickly because it's actually related in some way to what I ended up doing. It was a non-religious teen tour, and it was Leil Tisha B'Av. And I had heard that that's a big social scene. So I suggested to the counselor that the group that we go there to the Kotel on Leil Tisha B'Av, and we went. And there were two things that struck me about it. The first was, this was around the time when the Ethiopian Jews had started coming in large numbers. You had Black Jews from Ethiopia, white Jews from Russia, Jews from all over the world who on the surface seemingly had absolutely nothing in common with one another. And yet they were all drawn to that same place at the same time for the same reason. And I realized then that there was something very powerful about our tradition, that it could cut across the centuries and the ethnic and social boundaries and bring everyone together in that fashion. Then there was a group of Hasidim who were sitting on the floor reading Eicha, the Book of Lamentations, and I joined them, looking for some kind of a cultural experience, I guess. And I noticed as they were reading Eicha that some of them began to weep, and I felt nothing. And I thought it strange at first that they were crying over the destruction of a building 2,000 years ago, and I felt nothing. Particularly when, you know, we open the newspaper every day, we see all kinds of horrible things that happen in the world, and it doesn't touch us really or affect us. And I thought about it, and I said, well, either there's something wrong with them, or maybe there's something wrong with me, and maybe I'm missing out on something. Maybe I don't get it. So that was another sort of important milestone.
How old were you when this milestone happened?
16.
I was 16. Okay, and okay, got it. So that was the impetus. Okay, so you moved to Israel, and then from starting your organization to moving, walk us through that process, because please.
So when Benjamin Netanyahu was elected prime minister in 1996 for the first time, I went to work for him in the prime minister's office. I knew him from beforehand, and David Bar-Ilan, Zichrono Livracha, who was once the editor of the Jerusalem Post, David Bar-Ilan became his communications director, and I was his deputy. Most of our work had to do with dealing with the foreign press, putting out propaganda against the Palestinians, and trying to cultivate a better image for Israel in the international media. One day in the spring of 1997, a small crumpled orange envelope arrived addressed to the prime minister, and it landed on my desk. And it was from a community in northeastern India called the Bnei Menashe, the sons of the tribe of Manasseh, one of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And it was a very emotional appeal. They asked the prime minister to bring them back. They said that their ancestors had been exiled 2,700 years ago, and they always dreamt of returning. And they wanted to make Aliyah. I have to admit that when I first read the letter, I thought it was just completely nuts. Growing up in Manhattan, in the New York area, most Jews I knew looked more or less like me. Perhaps not as handsome, but they mostly looked like, you or me. And I don't know why you're laughing when I say that, but
I was waiting for Rebecca to laugh.
Okay. Just the thought that, we might have some lost brethren in northeastern India struck me as fanciful. But there was something about the letter that was very emotive, and I chose to answer it. And it turned out the Bnei Menashe had been writing to Israeli prime ministers since at least Golda Meir in the early 70s, and probably since David Ben-Gurion and the founding of the State of Israel, and they'd never gotten a response. I met with some members of the community. I still didn't believe that they were from a lost tribe, but I saw that they sincerely wanted to be Jews. They wanted to keep Torah v'mitzvot, and they wanted to live in Eretz Yisrael. And I figured if someone is crazy enough that they want to join us, and they're sincere about it and they mean it, then why not? So I became involved in helping through the bureaucracy. I became involved in helping larger numbers of them to come on Aliyah. And when I first visited Northeastern India and I learned more about their history and their traditions and their customs, and maybe we'll have time to talk about that, that's when I became persuaded regarding the historicity of their claim. As crazy as it sounds, that's when I became convinced that they are in fact descendants of one of the 10 lost tribes, and that something miraculous was happening, that one of these tribes is somehow or other, actually, with God's help, making its way back to our people. So when I left the Prime Minister's office in 1999, after Mr. Netanyahu lost the election, I began thinking more generally about the question of descendants of Jews. And I began reading about different historical phenomena. We all know the Jewish people have been massacred and persecuted and exiled and forcibly converted, unlike any other nation on the planet. So it's no surprise that we would find traces or remnants of Jews throughout the globe. And I simply got on the plane and started going to all these far-flung places. And I saw that these communities, these people, they're still out there. And many of them still have a Jewish consciousness in one form or another. And I also saw that no one was doing anything in a concerted fashion to reach out to them, to reconnect with them, to strengthen the bond with them. And I believed then, and I believe today, that that is a strategic mistake of historic proportions, because we are a small people, we are a small nation, we don't have a lot of friends in the big wide world, and yet there are literally millions of people who have a biological and historical connection with us. So I think it behooves us to reach out to them. And I don't mean solely in the areas of conversion and aliyah. We're not a missionary people. We're not a missionary organization. We work with, for example, we work with plenty of Bnei Anusim, or descendants of Moranos in Spain and Portugal, who have no interest in organized religion, are not looking to emigrate, but they have an intellectual or emotional curiosity. What does it mean that their ancestors were once Jews? I think it behooves us to extend a hand to them and cultivate a stronger relationship with them, because we only stand to benefit from it.
So far it sounds like, being at the right place at the right time. At 16 years old, you're at the Kotel, you're inspired by these Hasidim, the Tisha B'Av. Then you're working for Netanyahu, the prime minister, and you get this letter. Had you not been in that position, you never would have known this fact. Is that correct? I mean, in other words, you were in 1997. Then in 1999, Netanyahu is out, so therefore you decide to get on a plane and you're actually going to India to do some research on your own. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so walk us through 1999. So you go on this trip, you confirm everything you just said, and then what's sort of the next phase?
Well, when I traveled to India, and I visited there quite a number of times for lengthy periods, and I met with a wide variety of people, both in the Bnei Menashe community as well as outside it, I rather quickly learned the fascinating story of their history and of the efforts that they made to preserve their Jewish identity down through the generations, which is something that unfortunately many American Jews, as we know, often take for granted. But it's not something we should take for granted. And I think that stories such as those of the Bnei Menashe are very inspiring in that sense, because they were cut off from the rest of the Jewish people. According to their tradition, their ancestors were exiled by the Assyrian Empire 27 centuries ago. They wandered in an eastward direction until they reached China, where they settled for several centuries before they were persecuted on religious grounds and forced to flee and settle in what is now northeastern India. The first Westerners to reach that remote part of the world were the British missionaries and military officers a little over a century ago. They discovered this population that believed in one God, whom they referred to by the Hebrew word Yah. who kept Shabbat, who kept kosher, who kept the festivals, who argued a lot among themselves, and who spoke about a far-off place called Zion, where their ancestors had come from and where they dreamt of one day returning. Most of the tribe converted to Christianity, and until today, for example, in the northeastern Indian state of Mizoram, more than 94% of the population is Christian, unlike the rest of India, which is majority Hindu. But there was a core group that refused to abandon the ways of their ancestors. And that core group is what became the basis of what we now refer to as the B'nai Menashe Jewish community. Many of the elders, I heard this story repeatedly, that in 1948, when word of the establishment of the state of Israel reached that remote part of India, it caused a stir, and it kindled or rekindled within them the desire to come back. Many of them actually packed their bags and began walking in a westward direction because they felt or believed that the Messiah was about to appear and bring them to Israel. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but as I said, it sparked something within them. And over the subsequent decades, they gradually built a Jewish community. And it was only in the 1980s that they made their first contact with Western Jewry. But even prior to that, they were living and practicing Judaism.
So again, so you go, this is in 1999, they're actually practicing Judaism in India, correct?
Right.
So did you bring these people to Israel? Walk us through so from 1999 till now, what happened with this group?
So all told, there are about a little over 10,000 B'nai Menashe Jews. Over the past 2 decades, Shavei Israel, my organization, we've been blessed to bring more than 4,000 of them on Aliyah to Israel, wow, working with the Israeli government and the chief rabbinate. There are another 6,000 or so still in India who are waiting to come. The most recent group we brought was in December of last year. We brought 250 B'nai Menashe on Aliyah. Back in 2005, the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Shlomo Amar at the time, he issued a ruling after I approached him and asked him to study the community. He issued a ruling in March of 2005 declaring the B'nai Menashe to be Zera Yisrael, to be the seed of Israel or descendants of Israel, and as a collective group. But he said because they were cut off from the rest of the Jewish people, they needed to go through a conversion process on an individual basis. And that, in fact, is what happens. Every B'nai Menashe who makes Aliyah undergoes a formal conversion by Israel's chief rabbinate. And then they are just as Jewish as you and I.
So that's impressive. So 4,000 of the 10,000 have already made Aliyah to Israel and right, converted. And when they come to Israel, my first question is, are they all in one community or are they spread out like everyone else?
So a number of years ago, I spent a great deal of time studying the absorption of the Ethiopian Jews to try and learn from the successes as well as the mistakes. And unfortunately, there were mistakes made. They came from a good place. They were well-intentioned, but they were mistakes. I'll give you an example. In some cases, they would take, let's say, 1,000 Ethiopian immigrants and plop them down all together in the same place, thinking that then they can have each other and it will facilitate their absorption. So in some sense, that makes it easier for them, but in another sense, it makes it harder for them to integrate into the larger Israeli society. I live in Ra'anana, and there are Anglos here, Jews from the United States or Canada, who have made Aliyah, who have lived here for 20 years and don't speak Hebrew because they don't feel they need to. And so they never really integrate into the larger society. So with the B'nai Menashe, we decided to develop a model of absorption, which we presented to the government and which they adopted. And basically what we do is we settle them in batches throughout the country, primarily in the Galilee in the north, of 25 to 50 families at a time, so that they have enough of a group from the old country that they can, sit around and have a beer and drink and laugh and whatever they do. But it's not too big a group that it becomes a bubble or a ghetto. And it sort of compels them to become part of the larger fabric of the society.
Okay, great. And so explain to me the other 6,000, are they all waiting to come or they don't want to come?
Yes.
I'm trying, which one?
They're all waiting to come.
So what's the issue? Is it a financial issue? Is the Israeli government, like what's preventing them from coming tomorrow?
All of the above. To begin with, as you know, Israel has the law of return. Law of return goes back 2 generations. Anyone with a Jewish grandparent, even if the person is not Jewish, but if they have a Jewish grandparent, they have the right to make aliyah under the law of return. That was based in part on the Nuremberg laws of the Nazis. Israel said anyone that Hitler and his colleagues would have murdered for having Jewish blood is someone that Israel will give refuge to. Now, the B'nai Menashe, their Jewish connection goes back far beyond 2 generations. So they do not fall under the law of return. Hence, we are required each time to get permission from the Israeli government to bring a group to Israel. So that is a challenge. Secondly, because they're not under the law of return, the government does not pay for them to come here. It does pay for the bulk of their absorption costs once they've arrived, but the burden of bringing the people here falls upon us, on our Shavei Israel.
What does it cost per person to bring roughly?
It's $1,000, 1,000 US dollars per immigrant. The B'nai Menashe have to take 2 domestic flights within India and then an international flight as well. And there are all kinds of other costs that go along with it. So it's about $1,000 a person. And right now, in fact, we're actually, we have permission to bring 548 more B'nai Menashe this year in 2021. And in recent weeks, you may have, if you've been following, the corona crisis in India has surged out of control. Just the other day, for the first time, they reported more than 400,000 new cases in one day. And there are various estimates by the World Health Organization and others that the Indian government is actually undercounting by a factor of 10 to 30 times. So I brought this to the attention of the government last week here, the Israeli government. And at the cabinet meeting on Wednesday, they discussed passing an emergency resolution in the coming days, authorizing us to bring the entire group here in the coming weeks.
Great.
Yeah, so it's, on the one hand, it's great because we have to save these people and get them out of there. On the other hand, it presents a formidable logistical and financial challenge because we have to somehow find the resources to bring them home.
So you need 6,000 times 1,000.
No, the 548 we're talking about.
Oh, not the remaining, just the 548.
Right.
But you said the other remaining, they all would like to come.
They would all like to come, but the bureaucracy here in Israel prefers not to bring them all at once because of financial reasons, and also because of a fear that it might affect the bilateral relationship with India, because no country wants to be seen as having a rescue operation take place from its territory. But I do want to this is important to point out though, without putting down, God forbid, any other immigrant groups, the fact of the matter is that the B'nai Menashe are just a quality immigration. They're a blessing for this country. They all speak English. They all have at least a high school education. Many of them come here with degrees from Indian colleges and universities. They all roam around northeastern India with one of these devices, smartphones. So they are up to date. They're in touch. They are on top of Western culture, for better or for worse. And so their absorption here in Israel has been phenomenal. Only 3 to 4% of B'nai Menashe immigrants require welfare assistance, which is less than half the national average among Israelis. We have a number of immigrants from B'nai Menashe who have received rabbinical ordination. We have others who we have one now studying at the Technion, electrical engineering. Others have become teachers and social workers. it's a very high quality aliyah and absorption, and it strengthens the country and the society.
It's funny. I would assume with the COVID risk that the Israeli government would give you more trouble now, but it sounds like they're okay with that, right?
Yeah, they're okay with it. Obviously, each of the immigrants will have to be tested before they arrive, and once they come, they'll have to be quarantined for 2 weeks and vaccinated if they haven't already been vaccinated. But you know, it's pikuach nefesh. It's a matter of saving lives, literally and figuratively. So we're going to do the best we can to bring as many of them here as quickly as we can.
Okay, it's wonderful you're doing that. But there are other groups you're working on. This is just one of your main groups, correct? Isn't there other area?
Correct. Yeah, we're active in more than a dozen countries around the world with a variety of communities. I mentioned the Moranos or the Bnei Anusim of Spain, Portugal, and South America, where we're very active. We have emissaries serving in a number of countries there, working with Morano communities. We work with the Bnei Menashe. We also work in Poland, as Rabbi Babich mentioned, with the hidden Jews of the Holocaust. These are primarily young Poles whose grandparents or great-grandparents survived the Holocaust and then chose to hide their identity because of what they experienced under Nazism and then communism. And now, in recent years, a growing number of Poles are discovering or rediscovering their Jewish roots and looking to reconnect with our people. So we're very active there. We work in Russia and Turkey and elsewhere. But since our topic today is Jews of color making Aliyah, and we've already spoken about Bnei Menashe, and we touched on the Ethiopians, another very fascinating community, I think, that we work with are the Chinese Jews of Kaifeng in China.
So first of all, I'm amazed at your work, as Rebecca said I would be. But how did you find these people? How did they find you? Can you give us a little? In other words, you worked for Natalia, you got that original letter, you went to India, but how's this process coming about now?
Well, nowadays, thanks to the internet, they find us. You know, everyone is interconnected, and questions of identity are questions that are asked not just in the Western world, they're asked throughout the globe. And people seem to have this strong affinity for the fact that their ancestors were once Jews. It speaks to many of them in a very powerful and emotive way. And it leads many of them on a quest for identity. Now, again, that quest, in some cases, it's a spiritual quest. In other cases, it's an intellectual or a cultural quest. In some cases, it leads nowhere. In some cases, it leads them back to the Jewish people. We don't judge anyone for the decisions they make. We simply try to be there and to help these people as they go through the process and as they wish to be helped.
Got it. Okay, so sorry, I kind of interrupted your thought process. So the Chinese Jews, give us some numbers, like how many are there? How many have you brought in? Give us some perspective.
Well, some of you may have heard of the the communities that existed in Shanghai or in Harbin of primarily Russian Jews who moved there a century ago around the time of the founding of the Soviet Union. I'm not referring to those communities. I'm talking about real Chinese Jews. Many people don't know this, but in the 7th or 8th century, there was a group of Jewish merchants from Persia and or Iraq who traveled along the Silk Route and who settled in Kaifeng, which was one of the imperial capitals of China during the Song dynasty. The legend goes that these 7 families were welcomed by the emperor, who gave them his blessing that they could settle in Kaifeng. And he couldn't pronounce their Jewish names, so he gave them Chinese names, the equivalent Chinese names. So Mr. Levy, for example, became Mr. Li. Now, that doesn't mean that every Chinese person named Li is a Jew, because if it did, China would be the largest Jewish country on the planet. It means that particular family, of course. The Jews settled in the city. They built a synagogue in the year 1163. They had everything that a typical diaspora Jewish community has. They had rabbis, educational system, ritual baths, etc. The one thing they didn't have, though, was anti-Semitism. And already beginning in the 17th century, a process of assimilation and intermarriage set in. The last rabbi of Kaifeng died 2 centuries ago. And in the middle of the 19th century, the synagogue that had stood there for 700 years was destroyed when a series of floods swept the city and caused a great deal of damage. Now, until today, though, there are about 1,000 people in Kaifeng who look Chinese, who speak Chinese, but who are identifiable via family trees as descendants of the Chinese Jewish community. And they are very proud of that fact. There are still some of them who remember customs or rituals that their grandparents still preserved until communism took over in China. Some of the families do not eat pork, which in China is a significant sacrifice because it's a major part of the national diet. And in recent years, there's been an awakening there, particularly among the younger generation who want to learn more about Israel. And I first visited there more than 15 years ago, and I met with about 80 or 90 of the descendants. And it was a very moving experience because they were making this enormous effort to reclaim the heritage that had almost entirely been lost to them. And when I got back to Israel, I arranged for a group of 4 young women from the community to come to Israel with the permission of the government and the chief rabbinate. And they came here barely knowing the Aleph Bet. But I'm going to say something that's not politically correct because I don't live in America anymore, so I don't really care as much. But there's something amazing about the combination of Jewish brains and Chinese brains. It's a very powerful combination. And they studied at a women's seminary for a year. And I remember going with them to the Beit Din. And I'll just share with you one story from that experience. There was a young woman there named Jinjin. Her father was one of the leaders of the community. And the 3 dayanim, the 3 rabbinical judges, peppered her with questions about halacha and Jewish belief and practice. And she aced the test. I mean, it was remarkable. And at the end, they informed her that she had passed the test and she was being welcomed back into Am Yisrael, into the Jewish people. Now, it's traditional at that point for the convert to take upon themselves a Hebrew name. Most women, of course, choose what we would call a standard biblical name. Rebecca, Yael, Rachel, something like that.
Sarah.
That too. When they asked Jinjin what name she wanted to be called, listen now, she said she wanted to be called Yecholia. Yecholia. Now, all of us in the room reacted just as you did. We raised our eyebrows and said, what kind of a name is that? Who ever heard of that name? One of the rabbis very politely asked her, where's that name from? Jinjin looked surprised and she said, Rabbi, it's in the Tanakh. And the rabbi said, well, I've studied the Tanakh, but I don't recall that name. Where is it? So she took out her Chinese Bible. She's flipping through the pages. There is a pasuk in Divrei Hayamim Bet, in the 2nd book of Chronicles, a short pasuk which says the name of the mother of one of the kings of Judah was Yecholia. So here you had this young woman coming from Kaifeng to Jerusalem, and she was teaching all of us, including the rabbis, a verse in Tanakh. But then one of the rabbis asked her, well, okay, look, it's in Tanakh, but why do you want this name? It's not a common name on the Israeli street. And then Jinjin said something very powerful. She said that growing up in China, she knew very little about being Jewish. Her father had only told her 2 things that he knew. Number 1, he said, Jews are smart because they do not eat pork. I'm not suggesting cause and effect. That's simply what he told her. The second thing he told her was that as impossible as it may seem, the day would come when God would bring them back to the land of their ancestors, to the land of Israel, and she should never forget that. So Jinjin told the rabbis, now that I am standing here in Jerusalem, having returned to the Jewish people, now I know that what my father told me was true, and that God can truly do anything. And the name Yichol Yah in Hebrew means God can. And she said she wanted to carry that name with her as a living testimony for the rest of her life that God can truly do anything. So over the years now, we've brought about 24 young Chinese Jews to Israel. A number of them have served in the Israeli army, and we have the beginnings of a Chinese Jewish community here in the Jewish state.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing those details. To talk a little about the Ethiopians. So the Ethiopians were coming before you got involved, right? Or are they still coming? Can you update us on that, please?
Yeah, I should mention, we do not work directly with the Ethiopian community because there are already quite a number of organizations who work with them. The Ethiopian Jews were first recognized as Jews by Rav Ovadia Yosef back in the 1970s, and subsequently by Rav Goren, the Ashkenazi chief rabbi, which is when Menachem Begin began to bring them in large numbers. At a certain point, most of the Ethiopian Jews had come to Israel, but then there's another group there known as the Falash Mura. These are descendants of Ethiopian Jews who were forcibly converted or converted under duress sometime in the past 100 to 200 years. And Israel in recent years has been bringing over larger numbers of them as well. In the past year alone, I believe another 2,000 came to Israel. There are still several thousand of them in Ethiopia. The government has said that they will bring them, but they've been pretty slow in doing so. All told now in Israel, we have about 140,000 Ethiopian Israelis. And, you know, if we take a step back and we look at this phenomenon, we have Black Jews from Ethiopia, we have B'nai Menashe from India, we have Chinese Jews from China. I think it underlines the fact that Jews come in all shapes, colors, and sizes. We are among the most diverse people on the planet. So those who accuse us of being an apartheid state, the BDS crowd, and all that, all they need to do is walk down the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and they will see a Western-style country that, unlike many others, actually embraces immigration and welcomes immigrants despite differences in color, language, and mentality.
Great. That's thank you so much for sharing that. Rebecca, is there anything that I didn't cover that we should cover today, please?
Unmute myself. I just, Michael, you want to spend a minute just talking about the structure of your organization, how many people work there? You mentioned you have emissaries around the world. And, you know, Michael's too, I don't know, polite, but this to talk about, again, just to reinforce that, you know, resources are needed at $1,000 a person to bring in these wonderful B'nai Menashe, what your fundraising needs are.
Okay, thanks for the question. We have emissaries now in countries such as El Salvador, Colombia, and Chile in South America. In Europe, we have emissaries in Poland, one in Warsaw and one in Lodz, or Łódź as the Poles call it. We also have emissaries in southern Italy and Sicily, as well as Spain and Portugal. And in India, we operate 2 educational centers for the B'nai Menashe, where we teach them basic Hebrew and Judaism, and we prepare them for the day when, God willing, they'll be able to make Aliyah. We rely entirely on the generosity of Jews and Christians around the world who believe in what we do. And now is a moment of great urgency, because the government has approved the 548 B'nai Menashe immigrants. And as I said, because of the COVID situation there, which is simply spinning out of control, even worse than in the United States or anywhere else, there is an urgent need to get those people out of there, to rescue them, literally to rescue them. We have a very short timetable in which to act and to do so. And it's the arithmetic is very simple. It's $1,000 per immigrant. If we raise $548,000 in the coming weeks, we can bring 548 B'nai Menashe back home to Israel. If we don't, we can't. It's that simple.
So tell us a little bit, because I didn't realize that there are Christians that support you. Maybe educate us on that. Do they approach you? Do you approach them? What groups?
Well, thank God there are, there are Christians out there who love Israel and support Israel and who have what they call a heart for Aliyah and feel that they have a biblical obligation to bless Israel based on the pasuk in Breshit, Perek Yud Bet, pasuk Gimel, Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, where God says to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you, I will curse. They take that verse very literally to mean that each of them has a choice to make. They need to either bless Israel or curse Israel, and there's no middle ground there. Obviously, we keep away from any missionary types or any of those sorts because no thank you. But there are plenty of evangelical Christians who, believe it or not, do not have a hidden agenda and who sincerely believe that there are verses as well in the book of Isaiah in chapter 49, verse 22, and in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 10, where God says that at the end of days, the nations of the world are going to carry our children, the children of Israel, back to the land. So they view those verses as a biblical imperative to become involved in supporting Aliyah.
Beautiful. I'm just curious, Michael, do you speak like at APAC conferences or how do people know? I know about you through Rebecca, but how do people know of you and what you're doing?
Yeah, actually, I did lead a session at APAC 2 years ago in the pre-corona days. And I speak at various synagogues and community centers, and we do the best we can to get the word out, because I think it's important, number one, I think it's important for Jews everywhere to know about the existence of these communities, because it says a great deal about Jewish history and also Jewish destiny. It shows, and when you see the efforts that people make to preserve their Jewish identity, when they don't have all the resources and infrastructure available on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and yet they somehow succeed in passing that down to the next generation, it's very powerful. And on a historical level, I think that we have a responsibility towards these communities. Many of them, their ancestors were torn away from us. They were taken from us against their will. The easiest thing for them would have been to just throw up their hands and give up. But they didn't do that. They persisted stubbornly, like good Jews do. And they didn't abandon their faith, and they didn't abandon their beliefs, even if the Inquisition was hunting them down, or the Germans, or the Cossacks, or whoever it was. So I think we owe it to them and to their ancestors to do everything in our power to welcome them back, to bring them back. And at the end of the day, as I said earlier, it's in our national self-interest. For God's sake, we need more Jews in the world. We need more Jews in Israel. We're losing so many Jews now in America, in Western Europe, in Russia, and elsewhere. So many Jews are unfortunately heading for the exits. And yet, at the same time, there are large numbers of people who were once part of us, who are knocking on our collective door and are asking and pleading to be allowed back in. So it's time that we swing the door open, again, while respecting halakha, no cutting of corners, nothing like that. But it's time to take a more welcoming approach towards them.
Great. Rabbi Babich, please, if you have, I'm sure you have some thoughts, Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Jacob. And yes, I had a couple of 2-3 questions for you, Michael. First, I want to commend you for your efforts. You referenced numerous times that it says clearly in Tanakh, in the prophets and in the Talmud, that was written many, many years ago, that there will be a day that from the 4 corners of the globe, Jews will return to the land of Israel. So it's quite remarkable that we live in amazing times, that we actually see this prediction, this promise unfolding before our very eyes. And for you personally, it must be very rewarding to play a role in this, to play a role in what the prophets declared, thousands of years ago, to play, to have influence in actually actualizing that prophecy to come true. Just a couple of questions for you. Number
Sure.
one, that in terms of the Ethiopian Aliyah, so you mentioned some of the challenges they had, and it's well known that even though there were great intentions, there were many complications in absorbing them into the country and acclimating them. Now, you mentioned that, let's say, B'nai Menashe had come from a stronger position in terms of education, in terms of their modernization, and you playing a proactive role in facilitating a easier absorption. But I was curious, the broader Israeli society, have they been welcoming? Do they, because with Ethiopians, I've known there's some issues. The broader Israeli society, do you find that the B'nai Menashe have an easier ability to acclimate and to be accepted by the peers around them, by their citizens around them?
Absolutely. The B'nai Menashe, again, they all serve in the army. So from a very young age, they are exposed to Israeli society and vice versa. And they develop strong bonds of friendship with Israelis. And a key component of our absorption model is that wherever we settle them, we connect them with the local municipality, of course, but also with what's called a Garin Torani. They're organizations who send young, idealistic, religious, observant Jewish families to settle in various communities in the north to strengthen the communities educationally and religiously. And so we always connect the B'nai Menashe with a Garin Torani, so that each family has essentially an adoptive family, an adoptive Israeli family, so they can have a Shabbat meal with them, they can consult with them if they need assistance, things of that sort. And that too helps to facilitate the familiarity with them. And the fact is that anyone who meets them and encounters them immediately falls in love with them. They are the most polite, kind, sweet people. They have a simple, pure faith. They don't have any of our New York sarcasm or cynicism. I often wonder.
Hey, we're New Yorkers. I know you left us, but hey, be careful.
Me too. I brought it with me. I brought it with me in the suitcase. But I often wonder if perhaps as part of the conversion process, we need to teach them a little cynicism and sarcasm because they just don't have it. So everyone who meets them really just falls in love with them. So that really, thank God, has not been an issue. And Rabbi Babich, I just want to add one point referring to what you said at the beginning. We say in Shacharit every morning, right before the Amidah, we ask God, Ufdei chinumecha Yehuda v'Yisrael. We ask God to redeem, as he said he would, Judah and Israel. Who are we talking about? Judah, of course, is the Jews, the Jewish people, the Judeans, that's us. Israel is the 10 tribes. And it's something that all the prophets mention explicitly, that Judah and Israel will come back and will be reunited. So I'd like to think and hope and believe that the return of the B'nai Menashe, who are descendants not of Judah, but of Israel, that the beginning of their return perhaps heralds something even greater to come.
Thank you. One other last question, not directly related to the work that you do, but more, as a former individual involved in Israeli politics, as well as someone who has a clear line to the government, it sounds like. You yourself made Aliyah, and people make Aliyah for 2 reasons. One, for idealistic purposes, to achieve a dream and to fulfill a spiritual value, a personal value, which you yourself did. And others come to Israel out of duress because of their host country is no longer so friendly and so hospitable. Now, there have been many reports that over the past year of a tremendously high application rate of American Jews to Israel. You know, whether or not people actually follow through is still up in the air, but it does sound like there, at least, you know, last spring, a tremendous wave of interest, and that's for a variety of reasons, anti-Semitism, political, whatever it may be. So I'm just curious, if you as a former American Jew who made Aliyah, and also maybe privy to some governmental inner discussions, do they anticipate a major wave of American Aliyah coming to Israel due to whatever, you know, political situations? Like, what's your prediction as an American-born Jew who is now very involved in absorption? What's your prediction in terms of American Jewry going forward?
Well, in recent years, the average annual rate of Aliyah from North America has been around 3,000 to 4,000 people a year, from the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And various estimates suggest that perhaps 80% of that are Orthodox Jews, perhaps even higher. This year, because of what happened with Corona, as you said, there was a surge in the number of applications. The estimates are that in 2021, there will be an uptick, and instead of 3,500 to 4,000, it might reach 5,000 this year, which on the one hand, statistically is a sizable jump, 25 to 30%. But in absolute terms, when we consider the fact that there are, depending on who you ask, there are 5.5 million to 6.5 million American Jews, and there are perhaps over 500,000 to 700,000 Orthodox Jews in America, the fact that there are only 5,000 making the move, it's not a whole lot. It's not a whole lot. I remember when I was young, going to ball games at Shea Stadium and later Citi Field and Madison Square Garden, where there were probably more Jews in attendance at one of those games than actually make Aliyah each year. So again, I don't pass judgment on the personal decisions that other people make, and I have no illusions that making Aliyah is simple or easy or convenient, because it's not. It's a challenge. It's a great challenge. But everyone agrees, if there was an influx of 100,000 American Jews to this country, or 500,000 American Jews to this country, it would change Israel so much for the better in so many different ways. So they haven't found the magic formula yet to boost that number, but we'll see what happens.
Are there discussions in the government? I assume there have been, to try to it is an astonishingly low number. Like, you yourself may have brought more people to Israel, you know, over a period of time than the amount of Jews who made Aliyah from North America, but it is an astonishing low number. I assume there have been active discussions and plans to try to increase that number. I mean, what have they tried in the past? I mean, sometimes I drive to Brooklyn and I see signs, you know, for Israelis to drive through Queens. I see signs for Israelis to return home, you know, but I don't necessarily see such a push from the Israeli government to make Aliyah. There's a push to visit Israel for tourism, that's for sure. You see it all over there on YouTube. I constantly get these messages, but I don't see such a push from the Israeli government in terms of inspiring American Jews to make Aliyah.
Well, I think it's, if we think of it in terms of, let's call it a business model, you know, they have a limited amount of resources they can devote to encouraging Aliyah. And so they have to look at the different markets available and decide where is it best to invest those funds in encouraging Aliyah. And, you know, you have much larger numbers of people from France, the Ukraine, and Russia who really want to come here. And so I assume that, you know, when they crunch the numbers, they figure they can get more bang for the buck, so to speak, working on Aliyah advocacy in the former Soviet Union, in France, perhaps in other places, than they can in America. And as you pointed out, Aliyah is generally speaking either a pull or a push phenomenon. The push being anti-Semitism, which I think we all would acknowledge has been on the rise in the United States in recent years. But then there's the pull. There is the pull of Zion, the call of Zion. And, you know, I didn't grow up in the Orthodox community. I joined it. But I would have thought that Aliyah from among Orthodox Jews would take a much more center stage, let's say, than it has or it does, not only in practice, but also in the discourse. We all know that there are certain parts of the community that are moving to the right, that are looking for, always looking for chumras, always looking for stringencies, asking shilas, asking halachic questions about the most minute of matters, which is on the one hand a very encouraging thing, but when it comes to some of the big questions, such as, well, is there a halachic obligation to make aliyah? Is there a halachic obligation to fulfill the mitzvah of Yishuv Haaretz, of settling the land of Israel? Does that apply today? Unfortunately, that's a question that does not get asked publicly, perhaps as often as it should. And perhaps if it did, perhaps if aliyah became a larger part of the conversation, maybe those numbers might go a little higher.
Thank you.
So, Michael, what I will say is with the tax policy and the socialist agenda in New York, I think your aliyah numbers are going to grow. I think, Rebecca, you would agree with me on that one?
Yeah, I'm considering it myself.
But Michael, you know, we had originally scheduled your talk for next week, which is Yom Yerushalayim, and I appreciate, because it's Mother's Day, you were able to accommodate us this Sunday. So I appreciate all your flexibility and your time today. Also, I know Sheila had some pictures. Maybe we can share it in an email when we send you a recording. Is that okay?
Oh, absolutely, sure.
Yeah, so we'll send out the recording with God's help tomorrow. Sheila does a great job with that, and we'll have some pictures below that that we can share with both people who are on the webinar today and people that weren't able to make it that will be on the recording to review. But and Michael, I hope when our building is updated and we're back in our building, that Rebecca will invite you to come for Shabbos. Do you usually bring some of the people that made Aliyah with you on these weekends, or what's kind of the program?
I have done that in the past. I brought some of the B'nai Menashe Chinese Jews with me to America to give American Jews a chance to meet them and hear their stories, you know, directly from them. So yeah, absolutely. If you can convince Rebecca to have me over, then I'm willing to consider it.
Yeah.
All we need is 7 million to close the renovation, and I'll convince both you guys. So
I'll start thinking about it now.
okay, but thank you so much, Rebecca, Rabbi Babich, Michael. This is really, you know, very inspiring, very enlightening, very educational. I know we promised an hour, we're a little over. So to be respectful, we're going to end now. But thank you so much, and stay in touch. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Be well.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.